Hello again everyone and welcome back to the Underground. So maybe you've been playing around with radio for a little while. Maybe you have a decent little cheap Chinese radio that you use a little bit every now and then, like a Baofeng or something, or maybe one of these Quanshangs, the latest and greatest from the Orient. But after a while you may realize that you need to up your game a little bit. Maybe you've realized that analog unencrypted communications are just not for you and you want to pursue the route of more commercial radio. Well, since most of the people who are contributing to the world of radio in terms of knowledge and sharing information, since most of these people tend to be amateur radio operators, radio hams, there tends to not be a whole lot of information on the internet regarding encryption. Because as we all know, encryption is probably the most forbidden topic when it comes to ham radio. Even asking about encryption, even just asking an innocent question about encryption on a ham radio forum or a board or something like that might get you insta-banned just right out of the gate. So, as we all know, hams don't really like encryption. However, that doesn't mean encryption is illegal. It does not mean that it's immoral. It doesn't mean that it's bad in any way. As a matter of fact, there is an entire community built around using encryption. How do you think businesses use encryption? How do you think a lot of agencies use encryption? Well, they use encryption through a different series of licenses, one of which is LMR, Land Mobile Radio. Now, this gets a little bit into the weeds, so I'm not going to talk about it right now, but just know that there's a lot of potential for using encrypted radios. Otherwise, they wouldn't be making these, right? So today let's talk about one particular setup that I personally like to use. It seems to work really, really well, and it's at a great price point. In fact, it's at the point to where if you're going to spend your hard-earned money on something like this, one of the latest and greatest Baofengs, plus all the doodads that have to go with it, by the time you've spent all of that money, you could have just bought one of these. So which radio are we talking about? Well, we're going to start with the good old standby. This is the TYT UV390 Plus. This radio in some form or fashion has been out for many years, but this is the latest iteration of it. And this one has two main features that we really want. First of all, it is a commercial radio that's sort of marketed to hams, and you will see why this matters when we get into the programming software. A lot of people get super frustrated with digital radio because they buy themselves a handy-dandy analog radio and they download Chirp or some other programming software and they don't realize that digital radio is a lot more complicated. But today, we're going to break it down very simply. Either way, we're going to start with the TYT UV390 Plus. Make sure it is the Plus variant. Then the regular standard variant does not have AES 256-bit encryption. It just has, I think, RC4 or some other lower level of encryption. But this one right here will get you a long way. And it's more water resistant. It's IP67 rated to be waterproof when you have the door on the side here to cover up the buttons, whereas the Anytone 878 series, well, let's just say it's a fantastic radio, but it's way more expensive. It's almost twice as expensive, and there is no way on earth this thing is going to survive in any kind of inclement weather. So, again, this is the radio that I keep coming back to. It's a good one, so let's move forward with it. And let's start with what you get in the box, because that's super, super important. Like I mentioned, if you were to buy something like a standard ham radio that is meant for ham radio operators, cheap Chinese radios, there's nothing wrong with them. However, price-wise, this is what, $60-something, $80-something for the newest variant if you want it. Then you have to spend $20 on a programming cable, and you probably will have to spend, $20 or $30 more on an antenna. Well, now you're in the realm of buying one of these, and this is exactly how the UV390 comes in the box. Now, don't freak out when you get it, because I ordered this straight from Amazon just to see what the experience everyone else is going to get. This is exactly how it came, and it says right here on the side, I'm not sure if you guys can see that or not, but it doesn't say plus. It just says UV390. So, not super reassuring right there right off the start, but this is in fact the plus model, and you can tell once we get into it. The reason that this radio has kind of taken the world by storm is because everything you need is in here. You don't need to buy anything else. So let's go right through it. So opening up the box, you of course get the manuals and documentation. You get the transceiver itself. And in the bottom, you get the programming cable. Now this is super important. Whatever you do, do not throw this away. You need this desperately. You can't do any of this without this programming cable. You get the charging dock, you get the battery here, which we'll go ahead and throw in. And you get a few other accessories. Interestingly enough, you actually get 2 antennas in the box. A sort of larger whip antenna like this one that you might have to buy. And I throw these on an SWR meter anyway, just to make sure they're actually okay to use before I use them. But every one that I've tested from TYT has always been pretty good. The other one is your standard rubber ducky antenna. So there you go. You're pretty much ready to rock right out of the box. Now the reason that I said keep this cable is because this radio is a little bit special. When you buy an analog radio like this, a Baofeng, a Quansheng, some other cheap Chinese radio, again, they're perfectly fine to use if that's what you need, but they use a special cable. So what you have to do is you have to hop on the internet and buy yourself, let's see if I can show you here, a Baofeng specific cable. Now the reason that you need a Baofeng specific cable is because these radios are made, well, I guess you could say they're kind of missing a few parts, so to speak. This cable here for Baofengs has a computer chip inside here. You can't see it, but there's a computer chip inside here that allows your computer to talk to this radio. The UV390 does not need such, because that chip that's in the cable is not in the cable. It's actually already in the radio. So really, a few years ago, people were getting scammed on places like eBay or Amazon because they were buying cables that were just dumb. They were just a simple Kenwood style connector cable, and they were trying to use them with their Baofengs, and they were figuring out it wasn't working because you needed to buy this special cable with the special computer chip in here that allows your computer to talk to the radio. Ironically, the more expensive radio needs the cheaper cable, so make sure you keep that because that's going to come with it. Again, every one of these that I've bought also comes with one of these little mini CDs. I didn't even know they were still doing these anymore, but it comes with a little mini CD for the driver software to make this cable and radio work. You don't necessarily need to keep this because you can download it, the most recent version, from the internet. So let's go ahead and jump to that. Now, the place that I prefer to get software for these, you're going to need 2 things, maybe. You will definitely need the CPS, or Customer Programming Software. This is the software, if you're familiar with programming some of these other radios, it's like Chirp, but it's for these specific radios. So I like to go to buy2wayradios.com, find the radio for sale. You can buy it from these guys if you want. They're not a sponsor or anything, but they do have documentation and downloads. So you can download the zip file that has the CPS software in it for whichever radio you get. Also listed there is the USB cable driver if you need it. You should not need it. If you're running on Windows, you should not need it, but you might. So get them both while they're there. Keep them stored away. You never know. Once you have downloaded, unzipped, and installed the driver, if you so choose, just double click on it. It's fairly simple, very easy to do. Same thing with the CPS. Double click the exe file. There you go. You will get this. This is the daunting part. This is the scary screen that a lot of people tend to get overwhelmed with, but fear not. We're going to take this one step at a time and show the easiest, most simple way to set all of this up. Now, before we get sucked into the computer here, let's talk about a couple things you're going to need to do with your radio. So the first thing that you're going to need to do is open and take the side door off here. It's just a simple thumb screw. You may need a screwdriver to open it for the first time, but that's going to expose the ports where you're going to plug in your cable. The other thing that you're going to need to do is unlock your radio. And this comes into that sort of weird cultural thing where you may have a lot of questions, but nobody's going to give you a straight answer. So let me clarify something a little bit. Many of you may know that when you buy really any radio from China, it's locked down. They do this to get around the FCC or to make cooperation with the FCC a little easier. And what they do is they make it so that when you turn your radio on, you're not able to change any you're not able to change any of the frequencies. You're only locked to a certain frequency. In this case, this radio is seriously locked down. Every version that I've got from this, you can't change any of the frequencies from the panel here. You actually have to unlock it. Normally, like your Baofengs, they're going to be locked to a certain range of frequencies. But with every little radio, even Japanese radios or higher grade American radios or something like that, they have a little secret code to unlock them. And for this radio, what you have to do is look here on the side. See if I can get this focus just right. You have to look here on the side, and here's your push to talk, and here are these two buttons on the top and the bottom of the push to talk. You have to hold these down and then turn the radio on. And when you do that, wait for it to boot through its little menu, and you can let go, and now the radio is unlocked. There's no indication that anything has happened, but it is unlocked. Keep this in mind in case you find something gets a little wonky, you pull the wrong settings, or somehow or another it gets messed up. You find you can't change the frequency. Just remember that's the way that is. So plug it in with the UV390. Again, to avoid hours and hours and hours of troubleshooting, take your thumb and push on it really hard, because it's really hard to get that connector in there with this specific model of radio the first couple of times. Sometimes you might even get an audible click, just like that. And now it's seated just fine. Now, with the radio, again, turned off, we can plug this into our computer. Now I've got the radio plugged in over here. What I'm going to do is go to my computer and pull up Device Manager. And from the Device Manager menu, I'm going to make sure that Universal Serial Bus Controllers is expanded, and the one that says Ports, COM, and LPT is also expanded. What we're trying to do is find out how this radio is communicating with the computer, and this is purely a troubleshooting step. This radio is smart, and it doesn't need any of this. We don't need to know what COM port it's on. We don't need to check it and make sure the driver's okay. It works right out of the box most of the time. There are exceptions depending on your computer and situations, and if you're trying to program other radios, you need to do this step anyway. So what I always do when I got a new radio, pull up Device Manager, plug it in, turn it on, and see what changes. Hopefully it will come in as what it's supposed to be. This radio here will show up in your Universal Serial Bus Controllers menu as STM device in DFU mode. Great, that means it's working. If it comes in as something else, you may need to run the driver, unplug everything, restart your computer, and try again. But now that this came in, this was kind of a moot point, but it's good practice. It's always good practice to do, so get into the habit of doing that. Either way, we're all good to go now. So once we have our CPS up and running here, the very first step, again, with any new radio, this is universal, no matter what radio you use, you always want to click Read from the radio. Sometimes there's discrepancies between what the CPS software has as the defaults and what your radio ships with, because again, radios are going to be sitting on the shelves and maybe out of date slightly. So what you want to do is pull it from the radio. That way we're not messing with anything wonky here. We don't need to cause any problems. So now that we've read from the radio, we can begin this process. It seems a lot more involved. Please do not let yourself get overwhelmed. We're going to take this one step at a time and do it in the most simple way possible. The brief disclaimer with that is that since we're going to cover this simply, we're not using a lot of the features of DMR. DMR radios, digital radios that use the DMR standard, are not really intended to be used like this. We may have our, UV5Rs or Baofangs, and we might have our Quanshangs here. And really, people are going to be using these radios, these old school analog radios, in one of two ways. They're going to be talking from radio to radio, or they're going to be talking from radio to repeater to other radios in the repeater network. Well, with DMR, it gets really squirrely because there's a lot of other things you can do with DMR. But fear not, we're going to set up everything simply so that this is the most bare bones DMR setup that has ever been. So Now that we've read our radio, the very first thing that we're going to want to do is save everything. Always save everything. So click File, Save As, and you can save it however you want. As you can see here, I already have 2 profiles for my personal radio right here. One for one radio, one for another radio, for other, depending on how you want to use it. But that's what you want to do, is save it. So I'm going to go ahead and save that there. And the next thing that we're going to talk about before we get into the super scary encryption stuff is we're going to make some quality of life improvements. These things will make your life so much easier and be less frustrating in the long run. And that lies with the general settings page. So getting used to this software takes a little bit of doing. You're going to be a little bit frustrated when you find out that these windows just going to move around inside this. This design choice, by the way, was directly stolen from Motorola. Motorola radio software looks just like this, or something very similar. So this is how it's set up. These little mini windows inside windows that you can kind of move around, and it looks kind of weird. But in any case, let's go down the list of things we're going to change on this page. First things first. Right up here at the top, we're going to give our radio a name. Now this radio name is really just, if you're a ham radio operator, your call sign goes there. If you're using this for LMR purposes, or you're not really concerned about ham stuff, you can put anything you want here. So let's put CS2A2. Why not? Continue the formula. Now right here, radio ID. This is one of those things that requires a little bit of explanation. This is essentially your radio's phone number, and you can choose it to be whatever you want. Now, if you're a ham radio operator, this is where you would put your DMR ID for the network you want to operate on. This is a DMR ID that it's like linked to your call sign. But again, this is not for ham stuff. This is for either extreme emergencies or for LMR guys who have the proper licenses to do whatever the heck they want with their radios. What I'm going to do is just choose a random number. In this case, it's going to be a 4-digit number. I'm going to say it's, let's say, to maintain compatibility with other radio systems, I'm going to go with 9987. Okay, so that's going to be this radio's phone number, essentially. You can, if you have another radio, like an Anytone or something like that, and every setting is matched and you're all like linked up together, you can go into this radio and say, hey, I want to call, like a phone call this radio, this number, and this radio will ring. So again, we may be getting a little bit over our heads right now. This may be a little bit overwhelming, but this is setting us up for success for later if we want to do some more advanced stuff. So make sure that you note the radio name and the number that you're using. Now, please keep in mind, if you want to get cute with it and you want to put your real name in the radio name spot up there at the top, I would advise against that, because if you're trying to be a little bit more private, keep in mind that the radio name and the radio ID, depending, I'm not sure about this radio specifically, but I'm fairly certain that on other radios, the name and the ID are transmitted along when you push that PTT, when you push the push to talk button, that data is transmitted in the clear, so it's not encrypted. Of course, it has to be that way so that you can decode the signal, right? Again, we're getting ahead of ourselves, but don't put anything personally identifiable in this block, unless you're a ham radio operator and you have to put your call sign or something like that. You know, privacy is non-existent on ham radio, but for other people who are on different stuff, different licenses, this is what I would recommend. Other quality of life things that you can change that are purely optional, what I do is I go over here and uncheck power on voice. That means it's going to not have that weird voice say power on or something like that. Now on the UV390, it's still going to have that power on like sound, but there's no way to turn this off. So that right there is what you're going to get no matter what, but you can turn the voice off. And in the same vein, I would also go down to the bottom of the screen here and change the channel voice announcement. Turn that off too, because you don't want it to announce to you channel 1, channel 2 when you're changing channels here. Purely optional, but it makes your life easier, and it's less of a concern if you're in a more sticky situation and you needed to use encrypted radios or something like that. Another thing that you might want to change, the default on the backlight timeout. So when the backlight times out is 10 seconds, that's the default. I'm going to change it to 5. So now that we've gotten our general settings changed, we can click save. Now when we click that save button, it's just saving that file that we created to our computer. It's not going to the radio yet. If you wanted to, you could click write to radio, and it will write that information to the radio. Now, this is kind of a pointless step, but it may help you to kind of get familiar with how it works. Writing to this particular radio takes a long time, even if you haven't changed very much, so just something to keep in mind. You might want to just get a whole batch of settings ready and then write once at the end. Either way, you're still saving the file to your computer so that you can constantly change it or update it or whatever when you add in more radios later on. I would note though, if you're doing this and you make a mistake or something, let it finish. Don't click cancel. You can mess things up that way. I have done that a couple of times. It's just generally advised to just let it finish its job. Let it finish writing to the radio and you'll be good to go. The radio should restart or at least exit the PC mode. At the end, you'll get this write data success. And there we go, we just wrote to the radio. So how do we set up our network? How do we make two of these radios talk to one another? Well, essentially, the bottom line is they all have to share the same things, okay? You don't need to understand how all of this works. You just got to make sure all the numbers match. Everything matches on all the radios. So, the only thing on this radio right here that separates it from, say, another radio that's very similar, even from a different brand, is the radio name and ID. That is different on this one. Every radio has its own name and ID. This is important. The reason for this is because we have to set up, we're not just setting up channels, channels that we can change like on an analog radio. We're setting up an entire ecosystem, an entire network. You have to remember, with DMR radio, it's not just radio to radio. It's really meant to be connected to, say, the internet, so that this radio will transmit to a special thing called a DMR hotspot, and that hotspot will be connected to, say, the internet, and that internet will go into a repeater network and all kinds of crazy stuff. So this radio, with the help of the internet, you can talk around the world with. Ordinarily, you'd just be talking, radio to radio or, radio to repeater to radio. Well, a lot of those settings for those highly advanced DMR ham radio specific uses, we don't need and we're not going to use. What we're going to do today is just set up basically a room in which all of these radios are going to be able to share, basically like a party line, so that when you key up on one radio, all radios listen, and vice versa, right? So that is the most basic way you can set up a network with digital radio. And essentially, the default settings in pretty much every single DMR software package are pretty much going to be good to go right out of the box, but we do need to make sure that we make some changes. The first hierarchy that we need to be nested under, so we're not just creating channels here, we have to create a zone. A zone which is like a memory bank, right? So there is a zone of channels, and most of the time we just click right here on the left hand side. We just have zone 1. Now this already comes pre-filled out, so they've got 10 channels, channel 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and this is already just the default. We're going to change all of this. We don't need all of this. This is all too much. We're going to delete all these, but just know that you need at least one zone, and almost all radios come with one zone created. So within this zone, what we're going to want to do is create some contacts, right? We want to fill out our contacts list. Now, with this kind of radio, with your old analog radio, you've got a radio, I've got a radio, you've got the frequency, I've got the frequency. We can now talk to one another. But That's basically it. We don't know who it is. There's no data going back and forth. And if somebody else hops on here, they can hear everything that we say, but they can also talk to us if they wanted to. Well, there's ways on analog radio of making that not happen, but by and large, there's a better way on DMR. And what we want to do is basically fill up our address book on this radio with all of the contacts we want to talk to. So remember how I assigned a name and a phone number, a radio ID, a number for that radio at the very, very beginning? Well, if you have your radio and you've got your number and you've got a bunch of other buddies and you know their numbers, you can plug them into your contacts list, and that way you will be all in the same group. So let's start from the very bottom and let's create some contacts. So let's go over here to Digital Contact. Now we can see that we have this weird menu structure, but we have contact name, and in this spot I'm going to put, let's say, since I want to create an environment in which, say, all of these radios here, see, I've got these 3 radios, and I want them all to talk together on a party line, just like how this radio might work. If I want them all to talk together, I have to create a group call. So I have to create a group net so that all these radios here, they're all in the same room together, they're all chilling, they're all able to talk to one another. Otherwise, they're not going to work. So you have to create a group call first, and that's what it's called, a group call. So we're all in a group together. So we're just going to call it Group 1. Okay? Now, we're going to give that group name. We're going to give that group channel a name, a number, right? In this case, let's call it 4523. Totally random, doesn't matter. We just need to know what it is so that we can plug it in on all the other radios. Okay, so now that's our group thing, right? Cool, right? Now we need to add in everybody else's phone number. So let's go ahead and add another one, and we're going to call this one Larry. Okay, this is Larry's radio, right? We want to be able to talk to Larry. And what is Larry's phone number? Well, let's say Larry's phone number is 9910, okay? And instead of group call, we want to make this an individual call, or sorry, excuse me, a private call. On some software, it might say individual call, but in this case, we want to make it a private call. This will become apparent later as to why we're doing it this way. But for now, this is what we've got. So let's go ahead and put in another radio. Let's say we've got, Mo's radio, and his number is 9911. And let's go ahead and add in the third Curly and make this one again a private call. And let's make his number 9912. The reason I'm using these is because I already have these. On some other radios, like the Anytone series, they have to take call IDs within a certain parameter. So I just stick with ones that I know that work pretty well. So just to recap, in our contacts list right here, we have got 4 contacts. We've got the group, which is all the radios together in one big happy family here. And we've got Larry, Mo, and Curly listed as private calls with their individual caller IDs, remote radio IDs, phone numbers, whatever you want to call them. Radio ID is the proper term. Their radio IDs listed. Now, what is this going to do? This is going to allow us to do something that we can't do with our Baofangs. This is going to allow us to accept calls, accept radio messages, so that when I push the talk button, I can choose to talk to just Larry on the same frequency. Or I can say just Mo or just Curly. And I can send them text messages on the same frequency, so we can all be on the same frequency, but I will be able to send them messages on the main frequency without bothering anybody else. Isn't that pretty cool? Otherwise, when you're using something like a Baofeng or something analog, not only can anyone and everyone hear it, that's something that you might want to consider just by itself, but the logistics of being able to say, all right, we're all sharing this one frequency because that's what our license has, or we've got 5 frequencies based on our license, and we've got to make the best of the space we have, right? So you might want to do it like this, which allows you to just ping each other on the radio on the same frequency without bothering the whole network, right? Because it's kind of annoying to be sitting there in your observation post or whatever and say, hey, Curly, pick up. Hey, Curly, pick up. And everybody's radio goes off every time you hear that. That's kind of annoying. This allows you to not do that. So by putting this in, you'll be good to go. Now, I should mention, you don't have to do it this way. What you have to do, if you want a standard party line, to put everybody together one big group, you just got to have the group call. That's all you got to have. If you just want to have just the basics together and you don't know who you're going to be talking to, perhaps, you got to have the group call, and whoever's on your network has to have the group call. So I could have configured all of these radios. As a matter of fact, I don't think this radio right here has these 3 numbers in it. I think it just has the group call in it. So when a call comes in, it will just say it's coming from the group call and it's not coming from Larry. Larry's name ain't going to be on my screen here, but this way it will be. So you'll be able to see who's talking, which is pretty handy. So if you're chilling out in the woods or you're doing some kind of secret squirrel stuff out there in the middle of nowhere and you've got a hot mic, somebody is sitting on their radio, they got their fat rumpus sitting on their radio and they're holding down the push to talk and you can't figure out who it is. Well, if you set things up this way, you'll be able to look on your screen and see the name of whoever it is. And if you don't have their name, their number, their radio ID, which will be required for the radio to function, their phone number, their radio ID that they set up will be displayed on your screen. So you'll be able to tell exactly who it is. Very handy feature. This is why DMR might be a little bit more useful than something like this. So now, we've got all our phone numbers in there. We've got all of our contacts. We're all good to go. Now we can close this out. Again, save it if we haven't done so already. So what have we done so far? We have set up our quality of life stuff. We've made our radio work. We have set a radio ID and a radio name. We have done both of those. And we have set up some contacts. Well, now comes the spicy part. Encryption. I know a lot of people might want to plug their ears to this if you're a ham guy, but encryption is fairly easy to do on this. The legality of which, again, is on the user. That's on you. That's your job to figure out if it's legal for you to use or not. I'm talking about what's physically capable. Now, here's the deal with encryption. Like I mentioned, hams hate it. They really it gets their goat when people talk about encryption a lot of times. But the Chinese are quite industrious, are they not? And they have figured out a way to market these radios to 2 groups of people. 1, the business people, and 2, the hams. So the hams may never use the encryption part of this. As a matter of fact, it's hidden. It's a secret menu in here that you have to actually unlock. So what you want to do is go to your menu setting over here and click Privacy Setting. Now, yours will not look like this. When you download this software for the first time, it will be locked. Now, what you need to do is make sure that you've clicked this window here. Click Control, Shift, and the letter P on your keyboard. Control, Shift, P, and you will get a pop-up that says the advanced mode has been activated. Close the software. So you close the software, shut everything down, restart it, load that saved file again, and you'll be right here. This is where you'll be. And you'll have these 2 tabs, Basic, Enhanced, and Universal. Like I mentioned, there's a little bit of information warfare going on with these radios sometimes, and they all use different secret code words to refer to different things. For most of the time, when you're talking DMR digital radios in the ham world, you will see radios with a lot of code words in the description of the radios. Now, fortunately, TYT doesn't care, and they say right on their sell page, AES 256-bit encryption capable. Fantastic. They're dropping the pretenses, but in the past, it had to be a little bit on the sly because we didn't want people, or the companies did not want to advertise openly their radio did some encryption. Legally, it's dubious with like FCC import laws. I don't care either way. I just think it's kind of interesting. So we go with the classic basic keys. It's like a basic privacy key. It's depending on your brand, it may be RC4 encryption, which is like, like 128-bit or something like that. It may be just a simple voice inverter. It might not be encryption at all. It might just flip the audio signature around, and any of this is easily crackable. What we want in this case is universal. TYT uses the word universal. That's their secret code word for AES-256. And you can see right here, once we click the universal tab, it says right here in the software, the first key is AES-256, its name, and there's a key value. Now this will all be filled with zeros when you first install it. And you should be able to change this as you wish. Now, this is where you're going to input your keys. Now, keys and key loading is very, very sketchy. Or rather, it's a little bit... let me just say there's a long history there, okay, that we don't need to get into right now. This is software level encryption, and it loads via the CPS. So you don't need a special thing. For all my Army guys out there, you guys remember lugging around a friggin' key loader and having to, whenever you've got to carry around this brick, right, and then plug it in, right, to fill your radios with the crypto, with the keys. Here you don't need to do that. You can do that straight from this. Some of your Motorola guys out there, that's how they still have to load their keys if they're running hardware encryption. There's benefits to doing it both ways. This is what most consumers are probably going to use anyway. So either way, it's backwards compatible. So in any case, if you were using an Anytone system or a TYT system, generally speaking, you need to just make sure that they're somewhat cross-compatible. For the most part, even the cheaper Chinese DMR radios, they're adopting at least Motorola Tier 2, which is the standard for DMRs. Again, for you nerds out there, DMR is just the code word for Moto Turbo, because Motorola invented it. So, kind of an interesting history behind all of this, if you're interested in learning about some of that. However, for us, we don't need to care about the history. All we need to know is how to use the stuff. So we have to understand how this works. What's going to happen is you load these keys, this long series of characters and text, right? This 256-bit encryption key, that's going to go inside the guts of your radio. And what's going to happen is, if you've got two of these bad boys, and they're working together, and they're sharing the same key, what's going to happen is when you do this right here, when you push to talk on that radio, this radio here is going to say to the network, to whoever can pick up, and it has the right talk group configured, it's on the right frequency, it's going to say, hey, encryption code 4. And this radio is going to say, okay, I'll use encryption code 4 to decode whatever you just said, or whatever you're about to say. And that's how it's going to work. It doesn't transmit all of these letters over the radio, over the airwaves. It doesn't work like that. Your radio says, hey, use password 7. And this radio says, password 7? Got it. Do they match? Okay, well now we can hear each other. The reason that I use this long drawn out explanation is because you have to make sure they match. You can't just put these in any order. So when you have the first row here, I would advise starting with one key. Start with one key and see if it works. Put in your key here, and how you do that is you just double click it here, and you can put whatever you want to in there. I wouldn't advise doing this because even as random as this seems right now, it's not. It's not random. There are ways computers can figure out the width of the human hand and all kinds of stuff like that. So if you want to be truly, truly anonymous, look up how to generate a 256-bit key, and this will help you out. But for now, this will work. This is a short code. It's easily, I can see there's many repeats in it. It's going to be easily crackable, but still, you want to make sure that you got a good key. But for now, this will work. This will work. Now, something to keep in mind is you need to know which key goes with which number. So you need to make sure that number 1 is this key, and if you're loading multiples, they all have to match. You will save yourself many hours of frustration if you put them all in the same exact way. So one thing to keep in mind is that in the world of commercial radio, things are a little weird with the keys. They're a little bit more military thinking. So you may be familiar with what I just did earlier, and I had my radio plugged into my computer and I clicked right. Well, that wrote all the settings and all the contacts and such to the radio, and that's all well and good. Here's the thing though, keys are different, and every brand treats them differently. So for instance, This brand, you have to click Write Privacy to the radio, and it will write the code to the radio separate from your settings. Now, depending on which radio you use, Anytones can do this as well. You can have it set up in like a more military-centric thing, so that if you lose this radio or whatever, and somebody captures it, so I've captured this radio, well, I could just grab my handy-dandy programming cable and go over to my cool little field computer and pull the encryption keys from this radio, right? Wrong. And they make it so that you can't do that. So every time you want to change the keys, you can't pull them from the radio. At least that's the settings on this one. Some radios you can. Some radios make it so that when you turn the radio off, the keys erase. So depending on your settings, depending on how you want to do it, I don't know if you can do that with these, but some radios do that, and it's kind of an interesting thing. So it's just kind of an extra safeguard. So what I'm going to do, once I have my keys put in there, I'm just using the one for now, and it's a very poor key. I just did it with my hands on my keyboard, which is not good to do. But for demonstration purposes, let's go ahead and write privacy. Now, you can see my radio just went into programming mode. I don't know if you can see that or not. And write data success. Now, I can close this out and go back to, say, let's say my settings menu, whatever. Now this radio has the key fill. So this radio has two separate sort of ways of thinking about it. One is all your channels and your name and all that kind of stuff, and the other stuff's the encryption. You have to have both in order to make this whole system work encrypted. So now that we have the fill, we have filled our radio with the crypto, now we can start editing the channels. And this is where things get a little bit confusing, a little bit overwhelming. I know this may have been overwhelming so far, but it won't be too bad, I promise. So what we're going to do is go to our channels here. Now I'm going to go in here and I'm going to delete all of these channels except for one. We're just going to take it slow, do it very simply. Just have one channel. You never want to have one channel. Even if you have one frequency, you can set multiple channels, right, underneath different frequencies. So you just want to make sure that you start with one, figure it out, see what works, and we'll see the things you can change on it later. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through here and we're going to set up at least one encrypted voice channel that all of these fancy radios are on. So very first box, channel mode, digital. We want to make sure that it is digital. Also, we want to make sure in our bandwidth right here that it is set to 12.5 kilohertz. That's the standard for DMR. Analog radios double that. So normally we want to, in best practices, in this case the software is forcing us to go with 12.5 kilohertz, but just in case it didn't, that's what we would choose. We want to set a name for this channel. We're just going to say channel 1 UHF. Okay, cool. Next, we're going to put in our receive frequency and our transmit frequency. Now, if in all cases where you're going to be using this legally, using LMR rules and things like that, your FCC frequency manager will tell you what frequency to put here, what frequencies you can use. If we're talking more of an apocalypse situation, whatever frequency works, right? There are some best practices when picking a frequency to use in a contingent situation, but that requires talking at another time. In this case, I'm just going to leave it as the default because there's no frequency that I can pick that's not going to result in outrage. Either way, leaving it like it is even still very, very illegal because I can tell you this frequency is, you know, not the right one, right? So in any case, this is where you put your frequency. You will know what frequency to use when the time comes. You can put in prepper frequencies if you want, whatever. But if you're trying to use this, you know, with encryption legally, so on and so forth, you will know what frequency to put there, so I'm not going to rehash all that. Anyway, put your frequency there. I'm just going to leave it the same for the demonstration purposes. The next thing you want to do is come down here and click change your power level. Again, best practices, it's not just the rules, you know. I know a lot of people don't really care about FCC's rules, and I get it. But in terms of best practices, you want to use what? the least power required to make the communication possible. So you don't need to go out there and start blasting out all over the airwaves all the time. One, it's poor OPSEC for one. It's not good security practices. And two, it's inconsiderate. And three, it's just not, it's not good for your battery life either. So if you can get away with going on low power, go with that. Now I should note, almost all CPS software packages, they're just going to say low, medium, and high. You need to go into your user manual for your radio and figure out what those values mean. In this case, I'm fairly certain that high means 10 watts on this radio. I could be mistaken on that. Either way, going with low is probably 1 watt or half a watt. My guess is it's 1, 5, 10. That's just my pure guess. But in any case, we'll just go with low for now, just for the sake of argument. Now we want to put in all of that information that we made in the beginning. So here's where it all comes together, right? This is what I mentioned earlier. Everything needs to match. You need to make sure your contact name is the same. You need to make sure that your group list matches. And you want to make sure that everything matches. Your color code, think of this as like PL tones or something like that on analog. It's not quite the same, but you can think of it like that. The repeater slot, this is your time slot. So like I mentioned, digital signals use 12.5 kilohertz, right? So you want to make sure that you're on the same time slot. Just make sure everything matches. That's all you got to do, really. So we're just going to use color code 1, time slot, repeat. In this case, this software says repeater slot 1. And right here at the bottom, privacy switch. Here we go. We're going to check that box and have this other menu pop up. And now that we have this drop down where we can pick universal. If you remember, universal was the AES 256. And another box just appeared, which we can click that says privacy number. Well, remember how I said you got to make sure all the numbers match? Well, this would be our code. We just put in one AES key, and if you remember, that key was 1. So that needs to go here. If you're using multiple keys, like if say you wanted to create another channel that's exactly the same but with a different encryption key, you can choose whichever one it is. Now in this case the default goes up to 16, but you can make it more than that, I'm fairly certain. Either way, that's pretty much it. You're pretty much done. Really all you need to do at this point is make sure you save your work, of course, and then write it to the radio. So once you have written that to the radio, you are good to go. You should be able to hop right on in to channel 1 on your radio here and do the same with the other radios. Of course, making sure that all of them have each other's call signs. So one thing that gets a little bit frustrating if you're the radio guy for your group is, say this radio has, you know, radio ID such and such. Well, it needs to have contacts A, B, and C. You know, this radio needs to have contacts B, C, and D. This one needs to have A, B, and D, and so on and so forth. So it can get a little bit confusing. That's why they even have a little tab on the radio to let you know which one it is. So my advice, it doesn't cost you anything in security. Take a Sharpie or something or a piece of tape, put it on the radio as to what the number is, what the phone number is. Contact name doesn't really matter. You can change that for each radio. Really, this contacts list is just to make sure that your radio, when your radio hears 9910, it's going to associate that number with Larry. Now, you can change that Larry's name to whatever you want it to be. You can change it to be, you know, pain in the butt or whatever, and you can put that in your own radio. But if you don't have that programmed at all, when Larry makes a phone call and all you have is just the group, if you don't have anything in your radio, you're not going to hear Larry. You're going to hear the message, but it's not going to decrypt or anything. But if you have the group name and Larry hops on your network, but you don't have Larry's phone number ahead of time, it's just going to show Larry's phone number. Okay, so you'll be able to change that. You can even change that in your radio if you so choose. But in any case, that's really the basis for setting this up. This is using decently good practices to get us set up for some things that might be a little bit more complicated in the future. Again, once you get a good code plug, you can save that and then export that as well. or you can just hand jam it in. Most of the time, if you're using encryption legally, you're not going to be putting in a whole lot of frequencies. But again, if you were to pull up, say, your channel list, and you wanted to add another channel, you could do that. And because these are our multi-band radios here, they do analog as well. So if you've got a buddy across town and all he's got is the Baofeng and a frequency and a time of day to call you, you can still contact him on this. You just switch to his channel. You program in specifically the data that he's given you, and you can have that set up. So that's why a lot of people, they'll set up on this one radio, compartmentalized from each other. They'll have, say, 2 or 3 contacts that share an encrypted channel, right? And then channel 2 will be like a larger group of neighbors, and then channel 3 will be like maybe a statewide network, and then all the other channels will be like the standard prepper channels. So again, there's a lot of different ways to set these up. Generally speaking, I would advise, if you're just getting started, set up one group, and don't worry about any of the contacts. Just do one group and see if you can get it to work. Okay, see if you can get the keys to load and you can get everything to work, because that's the hardest part, really speaking. So one thing that you may have to tweak, I'll mention it now. I know this is kind of a random note, but one thing that you may have to tweak a little bit is go back here to General Settings, and right here it says TX Transmit Preamble Duration. The default here is 600 milliseconds. You may have to lower that or extend it. It's up to you. It gets kind of complicated explaining what that is. But basically, there is a short period of time from the time that you press this button to where the transmission is actually going through and being decoded on the other end. This lengthens or shortens that time. 600 milliseconds is fairly standard, I think. I mean, it's the default on a lot of software packages, but anyway, you may have to change it. It's up to you. I wouldn't worry about it right now. Just get it to work with these $120 radios, and you should be good to go. So again, you can set up scan lists as well. All you got to do is go over here to your scan list and then add in all of these channels to your scan list, and you can scan through these channels. You can do dual monitoring. You can do all this other advanced stuff. But again, this is just the beginning. This is just a start showing you how to get familiar with some of these terms like group list and channel and digital contacts and radio ID and keys and key loading and writing the keys and, storing the keys and so on and so forth. So just something to keep in mind is that, again, we're using this, or I'm guessing that if you're watching this video, you're probably not really interested in the ham radio side of things. So when it comes to ham radio and DMR, there's a lot more to learn. There's a lot more to do. But most of the time, you're probably just not going to use it. So again, these are the basics. This should get you going pretty good. And this is a fairly solid radio to use. Again, I will have much more content on a lot more of these other things, but this should get you started right out of the gate. The only thing that you got to provide is a frequency. You got to choose your frequency, and that will either be chosen for you, or in an apocalypse situation where we're not caring about little paper licenses anymore, you've got to just pick one that works for you. So again, sky's your limit. Hopefully this has been helpful for a lot of you. I know that a lot of this can be very overwhelming, and it's not exactly the easiest thing in the world to learn, and it takes you a long time to learn it. Trust me, I've been there. But hopefully this will clear the air on some of these things that you may be too afraid to ask, to be honest. Because let's be honest, when it comes to encryption and some of the more contentious topics, the ham radio community isn't exactly the friendliest source of information, but this will get you started right out of the door. It's a lot simpler than what you might want to think it is, and once you understand the basics, you can move on to more expensive, cooler, more tactical radios that operate basically the same way. Let me put it to you this way. With a $120 radio, you can learn everything there is to know about Motorola and Hytera and some of these other high, very expensive, $1,000 plus radios. You can learn the basics of right here. So again, this is a perfectly acceptable operational radio. So is the Anytone. The Anytone is just perfectly fine. People may give you grief about using an analog radio. I personally don't, because radios have different uses, right? So if this is all you can afford, okay, that's fine. There's no shame in that, as long as you recognize the vulnerabilities and you take steps to reduce them. With this, same thing. There's no shame in going with these over a $2,000 or $3,000 Motorola. There's no shame in that at all. And these are, you know, very operationally capable in their own right. So, again, hopefully this has been helpful. I will have much more to come on this, but for now, this will get you started. So, thank you all for watching, and we will see you next time. And as always, hide in the shade.